But I just wanted to try to understand, like, how Muslims believe that they can overcome sin. Like how we believe we can overcome sin through Jesus Christ and his blood on the cross. How they believe they can overcome sin, and if they are even motivated to, and where that power comes from.
Very good question, a very incisive one. I think your insight may be keener than you realize here, because of all the major issues that I find between Islam and Christianity, there's a lot in common. But I think the biggest factor, theologically speaking, that separates Islam from Christianity is that nature of sin. I think that's the one thing, and people don't realize it. We say the word sin, they say the word sin, and we think we mean the same thing. We don't. Because as Christians, when we speak about sin, we're talking about something we can never overcome by ourselves, just like you've intimated. We're talking about something that's so damaging, so devastating, that it pervades and permeates every aspect of our being and our world, and it turns our world from the Garden of Eden into planes falling out of the sky in Syria in crisis and Palestine and Israel. I mean, that's what sin does. From living in communion, walking with God in the garden, to serial rapists and murderers. That's how bad sin is. And in the Christian notion, we've kind of embodied that to the point where we cannot resolve sin. Whereas the Islamic notion of sin, and I know if I say this to a Muslim, they'll immediately have a knee-jerk response, but hear me out. The Islamic notion of sin is not that bad. It's not. Sin is something you overcome by doing your good deeds. It's like a counter. You have a counter of good deeds, you have a counter of bad deeds. And sure, certain of those bad deeds are worse, like murder is worse than, jaywalking or whatever. So some are worse than others, but they're still counters. They're not cancer, which is what sin is in the Christian worldview. So how do Muslims say they can overcome sin? Well, generally speaking, through doing good works. God, of course, has an element of grace in the Islamic worldview as well, but that's still through a works-based paradigm. God can overlook some of your bad deeds and multiply some of your good deeds, and that's how God shows grace in the Islamic paradigm. But this difference in the way we see sin is, I think, the core of the issue.
For us Christians, we know that we're going to go to heaven when we repent and accept the fact that we are sinners, and we sincerely follow Jesus, with all of our hearts. Now, with a Muslim, when they sincerely follow Allah, do they know if they're going to be forgiven, or they still don't know, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Thanks for your question. As we minister to people, it is important to enter into their mindsets, enter into the way they see the world, because we tend to often answer questions or say words expecting other people to think the same meaning, the same definition applies to certain words. Usually when people, especially like Muslims, for example, use the word sin, that doesn't mean the same thing that it means for Christians. So I'm glad you're doing exactly this, stepping into their mindset. When it comes to the Muslim notion of, well, for one, following, most generally people don't follow Allah. When it comes to Islam, people follow Islam. Slight distinction, and Muslims would say, of course we follow Allah. But pay attention to the rhetoric, pay attention to the terminology. From what I've seen, usually it's honoring Islam, and there's a difference there. The zeal that I've seen amongst Christians has been for God. The zeal that I've seen amongst Muslims has been for Islam. I haven't seen too many Christians zealous about Christianity. Mm-hmm. It's about Jesus. Mm-hmm. There's a distinction there. I think it's an important one to grasp while entering into the mindset. But what your question is accurate. Generally speaking, traditional Orthodox Islam, Muslims could not have been assured of their salvation. There were a few circumstances in which you could. For example, if you had participated in certain battles with Muhammad, then you would have been allowed in, for example, the Battle of Badr. That was one. Another is if you die in jihad, then you would be assured of salvation. That was another. There are some other circumstances in folk Islam as well. Some Muslims believe that if you're on the Hajj, and you die in the middle of Hajj, then you'd go to heaven. So There's those. But traditionally, in the broad strokes, according to Islamic theology, no, you couldn't know if you were saved or not. One of the hadith by Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, according to him, he said, even if I had 1 foot in heaven, I would still fear the deception of Allah. In other words, if I have 1 foot in heaven, Allah could still rip me out and put me back in hell. That's a hadith, it's a tradition. And so, generally speaking, that's been the view. Now, I do also want to point out that nowadays, Muslims kind of believe whatever they want. Especially in the U.S., they kind of take and mix and match whatever. And so I know a ton of Muslims who would now say, I'm assured of my salvation. But 20 years ago, you wouldn't have heard that. So it is important to ask the Muslims that are around you and that you're connecting with, what do they believe? That's an important one. But traditionally, that assurance of salvation only comes in very certain select circumstances, and they never really have it. I think that is a very interesting point, though. I have a friend whose parents, he comes from a Shia background, he's Muslim now, Christian now, and his parents would say to him that Ali had said, those who do good deeds out of fear of hell, wanting to get into heaven, they are like slaves. Whereas those who do good deeds out of love for God are like true followers. And now that he's a Christian, he says to his parents, don't you realize that's the Christian message? Is that God has given us heaven. When we do good deeds, it's not because we're trying to earn his favor. Like someone said earlier, does God get disappointed at us when we fail? No, God's love for us is infinite. It's his love for us that brings us into heaven, so we don't have to worry about that. When we do things for God, it's out of an expression of love. Like if I want to give my parents a gift, that's because I love them. If they tell me to do something and I only do it because I'm afraid they'll punish me, that's not love. But if they tell me to do something and I do it because I want them to be happy and I love them, that's why the Christian does the good deeds that they do. Same thing for self-sacrifice for others. It's not to earn something for myself. It's not indirectly selfish. It's truly altruistic. I love you because you are worthy of love. So there's a very big difference there. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.